Webs. Arc 1. Cambrian. Interlude 1. A. 1953. Dinner had started off wonderfully that night. Mom had made us mashed potatoes and a meatloaf. The whole meal looked so yummy. When Dad got home from work and hung his hat up, I ran over and hugged him. Now that I was 11, I was a little bit over waist height with him. He leaned down to return the hug. "What's for dinner, Mayflower?" I giggled and pulled him by the arm to where Mother was in the kitchen. He took one look at the gorgeous spread on the table and balked. "Doll, what have you done?" he yelled. I hated when he yelled. He knew that I hated it. I saw the way his face twinged with guilt at seeing me flinch, but he still yelled anyway. I made dinner. Mother was so matter-of-fact, so poised and confident in the face of Father's anger. "We can't afford to eat like this. That bowl is enormous. In a few days when that mash spoils, what are we going to do for dinner? Those potatoes were supposed to last." Mother looked offended. "May's a growing girl. She needs to eat." Father ran his hands through his hair and groaned in frustration. "I know full well what my girl needs, and this is not it. You've just never gotten it into your head, Claire. You married a poor man. We are poor. You are poor. We can't eat like this any night, let alone every night." Mother finally shrank. She was interrupted by Father. He grabbed at the pretty new tablecloth, raising it up. "And what's this?" he asked, hoisting up a corner. "How much did it cost?" Mother looked so nervous now. Gone was the earlier poise and elegance, replaced by desperation. "Albert, please." Father looked at her with the devil in his eyes. I knew from experience where this was going, and sat up. "May I be excused?" Father didn't offer me a real response, just waved his hand. It was the best I'd get from him now. He wasn't himself when he got like this. I stood up and quickly made for my room. I returned to the book I'd been reading before, A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. It was the third time I'd read it. I loved the Cratchits, the family of Scrooge's poor, overworked clerk. They were poor, but they were happy. And it was all because they had each other. I could still hear them despite closing my door. "How much?" Father growled out. "They were going to throw it out. It was a steal, Albert. I've been good. I got it at a discount," Mother cried. I could hear the whooshing sound of the tablecloth being pulled off the table and the following rattling of dishware. "How much, Claire? How much of my money did you throw away on this gaff of yours?" She answered so quietly I couldn't hear her words, but I could tell that my mother had spoken. The house grew quiet, and I heard the opening and slamming of the front door. I wished so badly at that moment that we were like the Cratchits, that we were a family who was poor but had each other. Instead, the Rileys were a family that was poor, and not one of us had anyone. 1959. I was walking down the hallway with Johnny. He was my boyfriend, and I supposed I liked him. He was a jerk, but he was wealthy, bought me clothes, and took me dancing, all things I'd never had someone do for me before. Mother was happy I had something keeping me out of the house more often, and I was happy to have an excuse to stay away. Home had never been perfect, but it had become miserable since Father left. Lost in my thoughts about everything, I accidentally tripped over my own feet and fell over. Johnny refused to carry my books for me, and I dropped all of them on the ground. Johnny turned around at the noise, and without much interest in his voice. "Dang, guess I'll see you in class, May." He left me behind as I was clambering to grab all of my textbooks and papers. As I bent down to start cleaning up, I saw that someone else had come over to join me. He was a boy I was vaguely familiar with. Ben Parker, I think his name was. As he approached, I saw a face that read of pensive frustration. Without looking at me, he quickly gathered up my mess. "What a piece of work. You date the girl, but you can't be bothered to help her out? Somebody ought to throttle him someday. That'd teach him some manners." Ben seemed to have been speaking entirely to himself and not really at me. It was a bit odd, but it would have felt awkward if I didn't even try to thank him. Thanks, Ben. I know he's kind of a jerk." As I said that, it seemed to knock some kind of awareness back into Ben, as he looked me in the eyes and gave a warm smile coupled with a powerful embarrassment. Sorry, I didn't mean to insult him like that. I tend to blow a gasket when I see that kind of thing. I'm not sure I'd be all that mad if you had meant to insult him. I wouldn't have been. I was getting pretty fed up with stunts like this. Oh? Ben stood up, a pile of books and papers gathered neatly between the crook of his right arm. I'm not sure it's very polite to let another man badmouth your boyfriend. I gathered up the last of my school supplies. Ben offered me his left hand to help me up, and I took it. I worry about being polite where Johnny's concerned when he does the same for me. I stood up and decided to just go ahead and shake the boy's hand while I was already holding it. I may if you didn't know. He shook my hand. I know. His face flushed an awkward but adorable shade of red. Ben. I liked Ben, and didn't want to let him die of the embarrassment I'd cause him if I reminded him that I'd already said his name once during that conversation. I let go of his hand and took the offered books. Nice to meet you, Ben. 1960. Johnny and I had hardly lasted another week after that. Ben and I quickly became fast friends, and even faster, found ourselves becoming something more. We were set to graduate by the end of the year. I knew our relationship wasn't likely to last much longer, with Ben heading off to college, and me with no real direction in life. Ben might have put up with me now, but my mother was right. No educated man was going to want a floozy with no prospects like me. So when he told me we needed to have a talk about our future, I'd smiled at him sadly and accepted his invitation to dinner. I would hold my head high and let the one good thing in my life go, because that was what was right. May, he said, his hand reaching over the dining table to reach for mine. I took it and imagined that this might be the last time his hand ever comforted mine. I've been scared as hell to talk about this because I've just been so happy these past 8 months. He spoke, his lips shifting from nervous frown to gentle smile. Had it only been 8 months? It felt longer somehow. But I need to just get this out there. I know I'm heading off to college soon and I'm not going to have the same amount of time to spend with you. Here came the cutting blow. But May Riley, I just can't imagine a life without you. Ben got down on his knees. Had he needed to tie his shoe? Wait, he's only on one of his knees. Will you marry me? I stared at him, stunned and crying. Yes! Goodness gracious, Benjamin Parker! You nearly gave me a heart attack! He stood up, and I pulled him into a hug and a very chaste kiss on the lips. We were in public, after all. I thought you were going to break up with me. Ben's face frowned, and his hand began to rub the back of his neck. What gave you the idea I'd go and do a stupid thing like that? I was embarrassed now. I sat back in my chair. My mother. She said an educated man wouldn't want to settle down with a floozy with no prospects like me. He looked at me, and I could see that despite the irritation that I knew he felt from hearing my mother's words, his expression was soft and comforting as we met eyes. May, the only woman I've ever met who I'd not have an issue hearing called something like that is your mother. You shouldn't listen to that hag. Ben, that's my mother. Show some respect, please. I was offended that he'd say that about her. I'll worry about being respectful where she's concerned when she does the same for you. Ouch. Fair enough. Ben sighed. It was a happy sigh, one that felt as if he was letting go of all the stress he was carrying before now. You know, May, I still have one very important question for you. I frowned. What kind of question could be as important as marriage? Ben gave a sly smirk, one that he gave with a quirked eyebrow whenever he felt like he was about to tell a joke he found hilarious. Where do we want to get married at? There are so many great places that I can't narrow it down, so I figured that you and your particular taste. Ben looked down at my plate of food as he said that. I playfully smacked him on the shoulder. Are you saying that I'm picky? We both stared at each other for a moment, then burst into laughter. 1960, many months later. Today was supposed to be the happiest day of my life, and yet here I was in my wedding dress, stuck in a room with my mother. This was one of the last places I'd ever want to be. I wanted to keep her involved to a degree, just perhaps wish I'd kept her a bit more separated. Are you certain that's the dress you want to wear, dear? She had been scrutinizing every aspect of today. Even complained that the grass should have been more green when we went to check the venue. Yes, Mom. Even if this wasn't the dress I'd wanted to wear, I don't have any other wedding dress. I mentally smacked my forehead after finishing that sentence because I already knew what my mother was going to say. I still have my old wedding dress in my closet. You could wear that. I can't believe she was still trying to do this, trying to make this about herself. If I put on her wedding dress, I'd never hear the end of how she saved my wedding and how much I owed her. Regardless, I liked my dress. I loved it, actually. I'm fine, Mom. I still need to put my face on and get my stuff together before Anna comes to pick me up. I turned away from her to face my mirror as I began to apply makeup. Don't you think you're both a bit too young, though? I spared her an annoyed glance and a raised eyebrow she could see in the mirror. It's a reasonable concern. I sighed, finishing the last little touches on my makeup. You and Dad got married after high school. This isn't any different. She did that snooty little laugh she did whenever I left myself open for a barb. The woman viewed every conversation as an argument to be won or lost. And look how that worked out. Talk about a direct hit. Mother's words struck my brain like an arrow thudding into a bullseye. We're nothing like that. Ben and I have each other. We'll see, said Mother. She turned to look out the window. Anna is outside. You should head out. I nodded, put on my last little touches, and got into the car of my maid of honor. 1960, minutes later. Anna Watson and I had been friends since I started high school. She had been 2 years above me, this cheer captain junior who'd taken me under her wing. I was so heartbroken when she'd left for college that I started dating that jerkwad Johnny Jerome. She hated him, and I could tell from how she would look at him during the few visits she made back to the neighborhood to come see me. She never actually said it, though, but when I finally broke it off with him, no one, except maybe Ben, had been as happy as her. Anna had been the very first person I'd thought of for my maid of honor. She adored Ben, thought he was the best thing since apple pie. It had been her who urged me to give him a chance when Ben and I were just friends. I owed Anna Watson a great deal, an astronomical debt for all the little things she'd done for me over the years of friendship. I never thought I'd have to pay her back like this. Anna sat in the passenger seat of her own car, my veil held up to her nose to stop the bleeding. But it's not fair, May, she bawled out. You're going to miss your wedding. I sighed. Anna, you fainted, and your nose is dripping like a faucet full of rubies. My wedding can wait. She just sobbed more. I'm such a bad maid of honor. You're a great maid of honor, Anna. I spoke sincerely while focused on the road ahead of me. We weren't too far from the hospital. Who else gets to have this kind of story on their wedding day? That got the smallest of smiles I'd ever seen the other woman give me. But it was still a smile. But what about Benny? He's gonna be so worried about you. I laughed. He hated that nickname. Worried about me? Anna, he'd be a lot more worried about you if he knew what was going on. She sobbed again. The poor girl was really going through it now. May, what if he thinks you ditched him? I plastered on a big grin and let out a laugh. Ha! Ben Parker knows I love him. He'd never believe I'd do a thing like that. My grip on the steering wheel tightened. I really hoped that was true. The wedding. I was running almost 2 hours late. I'd been lucky that Anna and I had left early with all the time it took to drive out of the city and get out of here to the venue. I would have been so much later if we hadn't. I took stock of myself in the rearview mirror. My veil had been completely ruined by Anna. There had been no salvaging it, so I'd just do without it. The dress was mostly fine, though my hair and makeup looked awful. I had to help a nurse carry Anna up a few flights of stairs, and the whole affair had been a mess. But she was fine now. Apparently some new diet pill she was taking was actually just straight up poison. I had parked outside the venue a few minutes prior, but was taking time to compose myself. I took stock now of all the cars here. There were fewer than there should have been. Some people must have already left, writing up the bride as a no-show. I hurried to get out of Anna's car. I needed to get over to the arches and to the tables. I had to get over to where Ben was, waiting for me in his crisp, clean suit. A car pulled in and parked beside me. A familiar light blue car. Ben? What was he doing only pulling in now? He looked to be soaking wet. Ben's face was racked with guilt and shame as he stepped out of the car, but then he saw me. My fiancé's eyes widened with shock and confusion as he stepped over to me. May, what are you doing out here? He asked, and I laughed at how absurdly the day was going. Me? Ben, what are you doing? Soaked down to the bone like that? That pond a few miles down? There was a boy playing by it as I was driving past. Kid tripped and tumbled in. I saw he was drowning, so... I interrupted him. So you pulled over and dived into a filthy pond on the day of our wedding? He looked down. I placed a hand under his chin, lifting his head so that our eyes would meet. Ben, do you really think I'd be mad at you for something like that? You saved a life. Ben had never looked so vulnerable as when he spoke the next 3 words. It's our wedding. I shook my head. It's just a day. It was Ben's turn to shake his head. It's the start of our life together. I nodded. Traditions be damned. I brought our lips together for a kiss. I pulled back and spoke into his ear. And we both started it by lending helping hands to people who needed it. I think that's a pretty good start to a marriage. Exactly 2 hours late to a crowd only half the intended size, Ben and I were married. 1993. August. Ben's little twerp of a brother had gone and had a baby. It felt like just yesterday that Richard had been that little boy at our wedding party who followed Ben around like he was the man's shadow. Now he was in his 30s and had a little boy of his own. Richard carefully oversaw the passing of the newborn from his wife's arms to his brother's. Ben, May, I want you to meet the newest Parker. Ben looked down at the precious cargo in his hands with a wide smile. He asked Mary, What's his name? Mary responded with a weary smile. The birth had been hours ago, but she would have been winded for some time. Peter Benjamin Parker. I laughed, and so did Ben. Benjamin? You named him after me? Ben asked. Richard gently placed a hand on Ben's shoulder. Just his middle name. Ben, you've been there for Mary and me so much. You too, May. I smiled hearing that. We'd only done as much as anyone would do for family. We decided on Peter or Penny a long time ago, but for middle names, it was going to either be Benjamin for a boy or Maybelle if we had a girl. That's so sweet, Richie. I gave my brother-in-law a big hug. So, when do Ben and I get to babysit our nephew? 1993. August. Hours later. I sat in the passenger seat of mine and Ben's car. Normally, I'd prefer to drive, but I couldn't bring myself to get behind the wheel now. Ben drove us home quietly, letting me take the time I needed to cry. Would ours have looked like him, all warm and alive? Such a bright baby, the way his little eyes darted everywhere, taking in all the world that he could see. Ben didn't answer. He just kept his focus on the road. After a few minutes of silence, Ben spoke. You did really well back there. I'm so happy for them, but... Ben had trailed off, so I decided to finish his sentence for him. It's hard seeing a baby. I just keep thinking about that miscarriage decades ago and the children we'll never get a chance to have with my heart as weak as it is now. Ben nodded while he drove. Did you see the way he spat up on Richie? I laughed and let myself get swept up into a new conversation. 1994. March. He's getting so big, Mary. I marveled at the baby boy my sister-in-law held in her arms. I know, she exclaims. Her voice is mirthful but exasperated. It feels like we're buying him new clothes every few weeks. She laughs. Ben finished setting up the playpen, so she gently sits him down inside. Mary placed her hand on mine and spoke sincerely. Thank you again for doing this. We owe you so much for this. Richard laughed at his wife's words. I wouldn't thank them, Richard said. That was uncharacteristically rude of Richard. Ben, mostly unbothered, raised an eyebrow in response to his baby brother and asked, Why is that, Rich? Because you two are crazy about Peter. This date night is as much as about me and Mary having some time to ourselves for once, as it is about giving you more time to spend with your nephew. Ben laughed. Is that why you're going shopping in Times Square? He asked. I frowned at Ben's words. Times Square? That's for tourists. No sensible New Yorker would go shopping in Times Square. Richard nodded his head, his expression characteristically aloof. Definitely, but Times Square means long lines and too many stores guaranteed to leave us with a night out with plenty of time to ourselves and enough time for you both to get tired of Pete. That comment irked me slightly. I hoped I'd never grow sick of my nephew. The thought made me think too much of my mother. I shook my head and told him, never. 1994. March. Times Square was engulfed in flames, and in the center of the destruction, a monster the world had come to call Behemoth. The street from under which it had begun emerging had begun to melt into magma from the heat it emanated. Obsidian-like rocks crusted leathery gray skin, its cragged horned face spouted a singular magma-red eye. The creature was a monster from myth made manifest. The Cyclops roared with inhuman ferocity as its free arm reached out towards the sky. Lightning traced its way up its arms into the sky, from which more bolts rained down onto the city. An icon and beacon of New York tourism was unmade in minutes. Screams echoed out all around. Even from such a distance, the news chopper's cameras picked up the curdling screams as it was unlucky enough to not be in the beast's immediate blast radius, watched those that were die instantly. Their deaths would only be sure to follow. An inevitability, some tried to escape. Behemoth's lightning struck down a man that had almost made it into a car. With ruthless efficiency, Behemoth slaughtered what must have been 1,000 people in a matter of seconds, and with every moment that passed, more seemed to follow. Blue light struck the side of Behemoth's head, followed by a massive blast of air that seemed to shake the beast. A man appeared. He flew beside the newscopter. He wore a white and blue bodysuit and a mask that covered part of his face around the eyes. The hero, Legend, spoke to the pilot. Back up, friend. You don't want to be here for this one. Beside him loomed the silent figure of Eidolon, channeling some sort of wind power to keep the bringer of the end off balance. Legend fired a volley of lasers that seemed to stun Behemoth. He roared out in pain. Legend called out in celebration. Hero's amplifier is working! Eidolon, together we can end this today! Two of the world's greatest heroes nodded to each other. This time, the heroes kill you. Eidolon spoke. He wasn't one to speak much in public, so the heartening declaration of commitment was something that would serve to inspire others. More capes arrived, both heroes and villains. A group of what were classified as brutes, led by Alexandria, flew directly into the Cyclops' space to lay blows into it. Alexandria and all 10 of the capes she'd flown in with hit the beast and managed to fly back out of its range. The impact was fierce enough that they actually knocked it backwards 20 or so feet. Somewhere over 100 costumed men and women had come to fight Behemoth, and this time it really looked like they were winning. Legend, this is too easy. This can't be right. Eidolon spoke, his voice heavy with concern. It has to be. Legend spoke in that determined way he said everything. Other blasters had joined Legend in firing at Behemoth. The beast roared in pain. Alexandria and the 10 brutes strong enough to fly with her into Behemoth's kill aura went for what seemed like could have been the killing blow. That was when Behemoth smiled. An image caught by the news chopper and broadcasted live. That grin would haunt New Yorkers for decades. Behemoth unleashed all of the energy it had built up from absorbing the blaster's strikes and turned it on the brutes. Only Alexandria and another cape named Blue Marvel were the only two to tank the impact. One of the other flyers managed to blink out of the way, but Behemoth had done what it set out to do. Get the heroes confident and take out the majority of the few that were willing to get in close with it like that. He played us like a... The hero was cut off. More lightning strikes go forth again, and the news chopper whose footage I'd been watching is hit. The footage goes off, and I rewind to the start of the tape. May, you're not going to see anything you haven't seen on that tape before. Ben's hand is on my shoulder. I didn't realize he was up. I spun around to look up at his face. Ben, what are you doing out of bed? Is Peter okay? He nodded. Pete's fine. I tucked the little tyke in for bed hours ago. What about you? I turned back to the TV. I think there's a blur on the ground near the end way off, near the backs of the street that kind of looks yellow and blue like Mary's dress. Ben sighed, plopping down onto the floor next to me. You've watched this too many times in the last 3 days. It's almost been a week, May. If Richard or Mary were still out there, they'd have come here by now. They wouldn't leave their boy behind like that. I cry. I know he's right, but I just can't let this be true. I'm sure of it, Ben. That blur, it's Mary. She's gonna come back and she's gonna take Peter back in. My husband's arms were wrapped around me, and I can't stop the sobs that rack my body. He'll be back with his real mother, and we'll go back to our life exactly as it was. Ben's hands wrap so gently around my own. I take comfort in the feeling of that embrace. I take comfort in having someone who could hold me like this and make me feel safe. Why are you so afraid? We always planned to raise a child together. When it was clear it couldn't happen anymore, we'd accepted that, but now raising Peter is something we owe them. It's what they wanted, if anything, ever. Ben trailed off. I'd been younger then. We'd been younger then. I lost focus on the tape. It was on the part where legend first arrives. I knew I could handle it back then, but now? What if I grow bitter, and what if we fall apart and I resent him, and he grows up with a hateful old biddy for a guardian who resents him? Ben cooed at me gently and placed a kiss on the top of my head. You're not her. Not every marriage falls apart, and not every mother has to resent their child if it does. Not every husband abandons their family. Of course he knew I was projecting. The man knew everything about me, just as I knew everything about him. I just want him to have the best life he can have. I turned around to look at Ben. His eyes were as full of love and wonder as the day we were married. That's why I know we'll do all right. 2005. Ben, of course, was right. With every year that passed, we only found our marriage strengthening. Peter was a wonderful and bright little boy who was growing into such a brilliant young man. Already he was 12 years old, and he could tell us things about the way things around the house worked that I hadn't even known. I never thought much about how the television worked before, but Peter had babbled on for an hour about light. Though Ben would tell Peter every day how proud his father would be of him, it seemed like the boy was desperate to impress him. Science experiments, engineering projects, and even a week where he played basketball before that little Flash Thompson punk bullied him off the team. I'd already given Mrs. and Mr. Thompson a piece of my mind for that debacle. May, Ben started, I just don't know how to get through to him. He's got this chip on his shoulder that's pushing him to run himself ragged like a workhorse. Ben sighed. Every day I tell him how proud Richie would be if he could see him. I'm telling him he's done enough, but I can't get him to slow down. I shook my head at him. Talk to him, Ben. That was the only way we'd ever get over this hurdle. Ben sighed. He placed his left palm on the back of his neck and absent-mindedly rubbed at the spot there. Yeah, all right. I'll go give it a shot. I followed Ben upstairs and stood outside Peter's room while he went in, closing the door behind him as he entered. I listened into their conversation in case I needed to step in to help. Peter? Ben's voice was always so confident that it felt wrong to hear the way it was laced with uncertainty and apprehension. Uncle Ben, hey, I'm not done with that book yet, but when I am, can we talk about it? Ben had given him his worn-down copy of The Lord of the Rings. He'd finished it already? I could hear Ben laugh. Really? After only a few days? That's incredible. Your father would be so proud. I lent him that same copy when he was your age, devoured it just like you did. My husband's voice had regained most of its usual confidence and the deep fondness we shared for our nephew. Peter, what is it? Peter must have looked unhappy. You always say that! Peter raised his voice. His volume was close to yelling, but not quite there. Pete? Ben asked. You always say that he'd be proud of me, but what about you? Ben took a sharp intake of air. Oh, Pete, of course I'm proud of you. You're You're the best kid anyone could ask for." I could hear them hugging and talking it out. I wouldn't be needed here after all, so I walked off to get some chores done. The funeral. I hated funerals. Hadn't even gone to my mother's, and I had no idea if father had had one yet. He'd be somewhere in his 90s now if he wasn't dead. A vindictive, ugly part of me hoped he was. It wouldn't be fair for a man like father to live a longer life than Ben. So many people were here. So many people I hadn't even known who he'd helped and whose lives he had touched at some point. Peter needed to be my main priority. I wanted to keep focused on my nephew. He'd been so hurt lately. Even before Ben's death, he was hurting. He's been through far too much in a single year than anyone so young should ever have to suffer. I saw him start talking with George. I hadn't seen him in a dog's age. Must have been 2 years ago. I considered saying hi, but I saw Robbie approaching the two. I figured Peter would rather introduce himself to a local celebrity without his aunt there. I saw Ben's union friends, Danny and Max. They were in town not only for the funeral, but also to keep New York's electricians' union alive until a replacement to fill Ben's position could be found. I figured I'd chat with them for a bit. My plan had been to spend the day with Peter as much as I could to show him that I was in his corner, but I didn't want to crowd him. "Danny, Max, it's good to see you two." I came up to give them as enthused as a greeting as I had in me today. Danny softly smiled. "May, it's good to see you too." Max smiled, and I took in the fact that he'd shaved his head. "You shaved your head?" I laughed. Ben had been asking him to do that for years. Max's hairline had been falling out for some time, and no matter how much Ben and I assured him that he would look okay bald, he'd never listened. I owed him that much, and you'd both been right. I look a lot better without the wispy strands on top of my head. He did. Somehow Max had managed to make himself younger by ridding his head of the last stubborn few traces of hair that clung there. Ben is going to be so happy when he sees this. A tight knot formed in my stomach at the thought. I shook my head and realized my pause had been taken notice of. Max gave me a concerned look. "May, are you all right?" I could only shake my head. Danny spoke for me. "You thought about him, didn't you?" I nodded, and my confusion as to how he knew must have been evident because he said, "I was the same way for Annette. I'd see something or hear something she'd have loved, and my first thought would always be, I have to show Annette this, which would always be followed by, I can't share anything with her ever again." It always stung. I clung to the part of his word, the past tense verbiage that implied this would get better. "So those thoughts won't last forever?" Danny smiled sadly and nodded. I asked him the other question I dreaded to hear the answer to. This pain in my heart, that feeling like there's something empty inside me. Does that ever ease up, hurt just a little bit less? Danny's voice was soft. He was speaking gentler than he normally did and had something of a distant expression. "No, not ever." Max, who I'd begun to forget was here, had his eyes pop wide open. He started to cough hard enough that I thought he might be choking. Max managed to get enough air to say, "Oh, hey, Peter's here! Hi, Peter!" Max managed to blurt out. Peter responded eventually with an awkward muttered, "Yeah." Now. I sat at the kitchen table with 2 plates set. I'd almost set out 3 out of habit and was still feeling emotional about that. Peter had missed the service. I didn't blame him. I'd almost tried to run off too. It was only after running into my dear old friend Anna Watson that I had someone to give me the courage to stay. It was good to see her again after so long. She'd even introduced me to her granddaughter, Mary Jane. Apparently she and Peter had actually been pen pals for some time, but they hadn't written to each other in a while. Mary Jane had apparently been hoping to meet him. I sort of got the impression she might have had a crush on the boy from her letters. She was a pretty girl, but it may have been for the best that they hadn't met in person today. Peter hadn't spoken much about his pen pal Mary Jane to Ben and I back when he had been writing to her. He never even mentioned her last name before, but it was clear he hadn't been as attached to her as she was to him. It would have been awful for him to be waving off her affections while he was trying to grieve. Anna and Mary Jane had left directly after the service concluded. They hadn't had time to head to the cemetery. Sometime later, Peter had made his way back with the same speech we'd all seen him practicing with before he'd left, as if he'd just gotten it from home. I hadn't said anything then, and I doubt I would now. Peter needed space, and I had to give him that. I was beginning to think Peter wouldn't be coming down from dinner, but eventually he did. "Thanks, Aunt May. This looks delicious." Peter and I ate in relative silence, neither of us really having a story to tell. I tried to break the silence. What would Ben ask Peter about? I thought of something and asked him. "So, did you finish it?" He gave me that deer-in-the-headlights look that told me I'd said something wrong. He muttered out, "Excuse me?" Drats, I thought maybe he'd want to talk about whatever he was working on. He loved sharing his work with Ben, had always shown him the little gizmos and gadgets he'd made as a kid, but admittedly, he had stopped showing off those after Oscorp. He still made them, though. He was always hard at work in his room making new things. I'd seen from cleaning it in the past few months that he's basically made it into a whole little workshop. I should have remembered how sensitive he's been about his work. "Your tinkerings?" I said using hand quotes. Peter spat out his soda. What tinkerings? I'm not a tinker." I grabbed a paper towel to clean off the table. "Yes, Peter, I know that. I was talking about your think-like-a-tinker work you've been doing for Oscorp." Peter frowned, his face contorted in concentration. He snapped his fingers and smiled at me. "Right, the think-like-a-tinker work for Mr. Osborne I've been doing the past few months." He nodded in and went back to eating. "Yeah, I'm done with what I was working on. Should be totally good and up to Mr. Osborne's standards." Then in a quiet mutter he said, "Probably, hopefully, maybe." After that it went back to being quiet. I couldn't really stand it for too long. I was reminded too much of dinners alone with Mother after Father left. "Do you mind if I turn on the TV?" Pete shook his head, finished a bite of turkey in his mouth and said, "No, I don't mind. Go ahead." The TV in the kitchen that hung on the wall between the refrigerator and the cabinets had been something Ben had wanted just so we could all watch baseball at the dinner table together. It was such a needless purchase, but it made him so happy to have it. A well-dressed news anchor speaks. "We now cut to our parahuman specialist and consultant from the Daily Bugle, Ben Urich." A brunette man wearing glasses and a brown overcoat stands in front of a house in the Bronx. The place looked like it had been totaled. "Thank you, Patsy." The man continues. "I'm coming to you from in front of a home in the Bronx today where quite the spectacle went down." He walked forward and gestured for the camera to follow him. "This was the previous home of Mac Gargan. Those familiar with this case will recall that Mac was a big-time member of the Teeth and was sentenced to the Bauman Parahuman Containment Center, aka the Birdcage, not too long ago. There was a hole in the side of the house's wall that looked like as if someone had pried that chunk of the wall off. Those who really keep up to date with the Cape scene or read my blog on the Bugle's website, Who's That Mask, know about the Itsy Bitsy Spider-Man. It looks like earlier today he's made his first move as a more legitimate hero, taking on two of the Thief's lieutenants. Though Spider-Man was successful in apprehending them, when the PRT came to arrest the villains, they were ambushed by Animus, who succeeded in freeing the captive lieutenants. This is in stark contrast to the NYPD, who had successfully arrested and retrieved the 3 unpowered gunmen upstairs 15 minutes earlier. I'm curious as to what it means for our PRT department that the NYPD and an amateur cape with no experience had more success against the Teeth than they did today. I, for one, am interested in what Spider-Man does next. The hero has potential, and if he's getting serious, well, I guess we'll see in a week or so if he lives up to it. I turn off the TV. "They got out," Peter commented. I gave him a concerned glance. "The villains?" I asked. I hadn't really been paying attention too closely to the news. "Yeah, it just sucks that they got away." It did, but it was something I think most people had gotten kind of used to. "Yeah." Peter glanced at the clock and started putting away his plate. May, I've really got to get to bed. I'm trying to get to school early tomorrow, so I need to go get some sleep. He sounded so responsible. Of course, I'll wake you up. Peter shook his head. No need, I have an alarm. He panicked and I shook my head. I'll wake you up if it doesn't. Begrudgingly, Peter nodded. Yeah, okay, I'll need to get up at 5. I ruffled his hair. All right, kiddo, go get some sleep. Peter rushed upstairs, leaving me alone. I wish I could do more for him, the way he freaked when I offered to wake him up for school. He was worried about me doing too much for him. Had been these past few days, trying to do as much as he could for me. It was sweet, but it has me feeling somewhat unneeded. I sat down on the sofa, and my eyes caught a folded piece of letter paper. It had been sitting there for months now, that I thought about it. Dear Mary Jane. Oh, Peter had forgotten to mail this. The reason he hadn't mentioned MJ more was the poor boy must have thought she'd been ignoring him. He'd written her a letter months ago and just hadn't sent it. I could do that for him. I got out an envelope and wrote down Anna's current address that she shared with me today. I wouldn't read Peter's letter, that would be rather rude, but I would send it. I needed to be there for my nephew. I needed to be there for my son, because without Ben, we only had each other. And if we didn't have that, we'd have no one, and I would not let my boy have no one in his corner.